My brother screamed, "You're making my children homeless." I turned to the relatives he'd dragged to shame me and replied, "If you care that much, one of you can hand him your house. Mine is completely off limits." "My children are going to be homeless because of you," Gavin shouted from the middle of my driveway. Around him stood the relatives he had brought to pressure me, several of them still holding cardboard boxes they had been told to carry into my house. I looked from one uncomfortable face to another, then back at him. "If everyone here believes you deserve a free home," I said, "one of them can give you theirs. Mine is not available." A year earlier, I could have answered instantly if someone had asked which person in my family disliked me most. It was Gavin, my 31-year-old stepbrother, who had spent more than 2 decades reminding me that I was not his real sister. The irony was almost too perfect. He had rejected the word family every time it connected him to me, right up until the day he decided being family should entitle him to my house. My father married my stepmother Maribel when I was 8. My biological mother had died when I was 3. So I went into that marriage carrying the kind of hope only a lonely child can carry. I thought I was finally getting a mother and an older brother. I imagined family dinners, shared holidays, someone to defend me at school, and all the ordinary things I had watched other children take for granted. On the wedding day, I walked up to Gavin wearing my flower girl dress and holding a friendship bracelet I had made for him. I had spent 2 weekends braiding it in blue and gray because I had heard those were his favorite colors. I thought that small gift might be the beginning of us becoming siblings. He glanced at it and dropped it back into my palm and said, "I'm not your brother. Don't call me that." A few adults nearby gave awkward laughs and told my father Gavin was probably nervous about the changes. He was not nervous. He meant it, and over the next 22 years, he proved it in every way he could. If a teacher called us brother and sister, he corrected her in front of the class. If a relative introduced us together, he interrupted to explain that we were not related. When his friends came over, he pointed me out as his mother's husband's child. He never once introduced me as his sister, not accidentally, not privately. Not even when doing so would have been easier than explaining the complicated truth. For years, I kept trying. I asked him to play basketball, watch movies, or let me walk to the park with him and his friends. He either refused or left before I could follow. When I invited friends over, hoping he might eventually relax around me, he used the opportunity to embarrass me. He told my classmates I had cried after being cut from soccer tryouts, even though I had never attended those tryouts. He claimed I still slept with a nightlight and a baby blanket when I was 11. None of it was true, but he understood early that people rarely stop to verify a humiliating story when laughing is easier. Maribel occasionally told him to be kind to his sister, and he always fired back that I was not his sister. She would sigh and ask him to lower his voice and let the matter die. My father said Gavin was struggling with his parents' divorce and needed patience. Apparently, that adjustment period lasted more than 20 years. Things became even clearer after my younger half-brother Felix was born. Gavin adored him immediately, because Felix shared his mother's blood. He constantly told Felix that he had one real brother and one fake sister. Felix was too young to understand at first, but hearing it repeatedly eventually led him to ask me why Gavin hated me. I had no answer because no one in our home had ever required Gavin to explain himself. Our family valued peace, but what that really meant was keeping him comfortable. The person expected to absorb the cruelty quietly was always me. The pattern was not limited to obvious insults. It shaped every gathering and every decision in the house. If Gavin wanted the television, I was expected to find something else to do. If he became angry during dinner, everyone adjusted the conversation until he relaxed. When I complained, I was reminded that I was more mature and therefore should understand. That phrase sounded like praise when I was young, but it functioned as permission for the adults to demand more from me than from him. Being the mature one meant swallowing hurt without making anyone uncomfortable. It meant accepting that an apology would create more conflict than the original cruelty. Over time, I learned to stop expecting intervention. I became careful, self-contained, and unusually good at solving my own problems, because asking for help usually led to a discussion about Gavin's feelings. Even Felix noticed the imbalance before he was old enough to name it. He would sometimes sit beside me after family arguments and quietly ask whether I was all right. Those small moments mattered because they reminded me I was not imagining what was happening, even when the adults treated it as normal sibling tension. By 13, I stopped chasing a relationship he clearly did not want. In high school, we barely spoke unless someone forced us into the same conversation. Gavin spent weekends at parties, while I stocked shelves, mixed paint, and carried heavy boxes at a hardware store. I saved almost every paycheck because I wanted a life that belonged to me. He laughed when I came home exhausted on Saturday nights and told me I was wasting the best years of my life. From his perspective, maybe I was. My teenage years were not glamorous. I did not travel, buy designer clothes, or finance a car I could not afford. I worked, studied, and saved. After graduation, I earned a scholarship in mechanical engineering. I worked night shifts through college, graduated with almost no debt, and eventually found a solid job designing manufacturing equipment. I built my career carefully, one raise and one promotion at a time. I was not wealthy, but before turning 30, I was financially stable and owed no one anything. Every bonus and every extra dollar went into a down payment fund. 4 years before the confrontation in my driveway, I bought my first house. It was not enormous 3 bedrooms, a small office, a decent backyard, and a garage that needed serious attention. The place was old, but the structure was sound and it was mine. For 2 years, I spent nearly every weekend renovating it. I replaced the flooring, remodeled the kitchen, painted every room, rebuilt the landscaping, and repaired the back deck, with help from a coworker who knew framing better than I did. I watched hundreds of tutorials, made plenty of mistakes, tore out work I had done badly, and started again. The first night the kitchen was finally finished, I sat on the new countertop eating takeout pizza and cried because I could see in one room what years of discipline had created. No one had helped with the down payment, no one had co-signed the loan, no relative had handed me $1. Every cabinet light fixture and floorboard represented time I could have spent doing something easier. The house became more than an investment to me. It was the first place where I did not have to negotiate my right to exist. No one could tell me to give up my room because someone else was upset. No one could dismiss a boundary and then accuse me of disturbing the peace. I chose the furniture, slowly, paid every bill on time, and learned the sound of every pipe and floorboard. When something broke, I fixed it, or saved until I could. That responsibility never felt like a burden because it was attached to freedom. Gavin saw only unused bedrooms. I saw the years behind them. He had never watched me leave for a night shift after a full day of classes or count grocery money so I could preserve my savings goal. He had not been present when I signed the closing documents with shaking hands. Yet once the house looked finished, he treated the result as excess, rather than the product of discipline. That fact matters because Gavin later spoke about my house as though it were unused space that had appeared around me by accident. His own life had followed the opposite path. He married Kendra and ran a landscaping company that did well for several years. Between the business and her salary, they should have been comfortable, but comfort never seemed sufficient. They leased 2 luxury sport utility vehicles, filled a rented house with expensive furniture, took elaborate summer vacations, and documented all of it online under captions about living their best life. Their 3 children had birthday parties that probably cost more than my first car. Every Christmas brought another mountain of gadgets and toys. Whenever relatives praised my house, Gavin dismissed it as cute for a woman living alone. He visited only once after the renovations. He walked through every room without saying anything positive, then stood in my living room and remarked that it was a waste for one person to have so much space. He said I would get married someday and move somewhere else anyway. At the time, I treated it as another insult and let it go. Looking back, I think he was already measuring the rooms in his mind. After that visit, we returned to speaking only at holidays. He ignored me unless furniture needed moving or something needed repairing. I was never his sister when affection or respect was involved. But I became useful family whenever he needed free labor. Then last winter, his business began to collapse. He lost several major commercial contracts in succession. Instead of reducing expenses, he refinanced his trucks, maxed out credit cards, and insisted one municipal contract would rescue everything. The contract never came. Creditors seized his equipment, both luxury vehicles were repossessed within the same month, and he fell almost 5 months behind on rent. Kendra eventually packed 2 suitcases, told him she could not keep drowning with him, and moved 3 states away to stay with her sister. Suddenly, Gavin was unemployed, deeply in debt, alone with 3 children and facing eviction. After they were forced out of the rental, he moved into my father and Maribel's 4-bedroom house. 1 room belonged to them, 1 belonged to Felix, who attended community college and returned during breaks. Another had become Maribel's sewing and craft room. That left Gavin and all 3 children crowded into the final bedroom. Within 2 weeks, according to my father, the entire household was miserable. The children fought because there was no room. Gavin complained about the food, the water pressure, and the internet speed. He expected Maribel to supervise the children while he supposedly looked for work. Months passed without a single interview. She quietly paid the insurance on his last remaining truck so he would not lose it while unemployed. Every conversation with my father turned into an account of how exhausted everyone was. I sympathized with the children and even with my parents, but I stayed out of it because the problem was not mine to solve. One Saturday afternoon, my father called and said he and Maribel needed to discuss something important. His voice was so serious that I assumed someone was ill. Instead, they arrived, sat at my dining table, and looked as though they were preparing to deliver terrible news. My father would not meet my eyes. Maribel folded her hands and said they had been thinking about Gavin's situation. The moment she mentioned how much room I had, I understood. She suggested that Gavin and the children stay with me temporarily, just until he was back on his feet. I asked what temporarily meant. She said a few months maybe, but neither of them could describe a plan. Gavin had no job, no interviews, no savings, no offer to pay rent, and no date by which he expected to leave. When I pressed them, Maribel said he was focusing on getting the children settled first, even though they had already been living with her for almost 3 months. Then she presented what she called a better solution. She suggested I move into their house while Gavin and his children moved into mine. I laughed because the request was so absurd that my brain needed somewhere to put the shock. "Let me understand this," I said. "Gavin does not want to stay here with me. He wants me to leave my own house so he can live in it." Maribel insisted it was not like that, but she could not explain how it was different. My father finally said I was one person while Gavin was raising 3 children. Then Maribel added the sentence I will never forget. "A young woman did not really need an entire house to herself because I would eventually marry and start over somewhere else. Gavin," she said, "needed stability now." I sat quietly and looked around the dining room I had renovated. I remembered weekends spent in drywall dust, meals eaten from an overturned bucket before I owned a table, and every sacrifice that had allowed me to build that life. They were asking me to abandon it because Gavin had decided his need outweighed my ownership. What disturbed me most was how naturally they described my removal as the flexible part of the plan. No one suggested Gavin sell expensive belongings, take temporary work, create a written budget, or establish a realistic move-out date before asking for access to my property. His discomfort was treated as an emergency, while the upheaval of leaving my home was treated as a minor inconvenience. They spoke as though my independence made me infinitely adjustable. Because I had no spouse or children, they assumed there would be no meaningful consequences if I packed a suitcase and returned to my childhood bedroom. But I had a job, routines, belongings, privacy, and a mortgage. I had built a stable adult life precisely because childhood had taught me how easily my needs could disappear beneath someone else's crisis. The proposal was not simply about bedrooms. It repeated the oldest rule in our family. Gavin created the problem, and I was expected to absorb the cost. I asked whether the idea had come from him. My father admitted it had. Maribel reached for my hand and told me he was under enormous stress. I pulled my hand away and reminded her that Gavin had spent more than 20 years declaring I was not family. She said that was long ago. I told her that 7 months earlier at Christmas, his youngest daughter had asked who I was, and Gavin had introduced me as Grandma Maribel's husband's child. Not Aunt Laurel, not his sister, just a distant technical connection. I asked whether he had ever apologized, admitted he had treated me badly, or even called me himself to request help. The answer to all 3 questions was no. He believed he owed me neither an apology nor a conversation, yet he believed I owed him my house. Maribel argued that no one was asking me to give it away. I asked what else she would call moving out so he could live there without rent-a-lease or an end date. She repeated that it would be temporary, but she could not define the word. I knew how those arrangements evolved. 3 months became 6 became a year, and eventually the children's need for stability would be used to make removing them seem cruel. By then, I would be paying for attorneys and defending myself against the same relatives who had pressured me to agree. So I said no. Not maybe, not let me consider it, just no. Maribel looked genuinely offended. She said she thought they had raised me to help family. That word, after everything, burned more than the request itself. I asked where all that concern for family had been when Gavin spent decades insisting I was not his sister. She said he had been a child. I reminded her he was 31. She claimed people changed, and I asked what evidence she had seen of any change beyond his sudden interest in something I owned. My father then asked whether I would consider letting Gavin and the children move in while I remained in the house. I refused that too. I knew he would never leave because he already believed the house should belong to him. Once his children had lived there for 6 months or a year, my parents would return to the same table and ask me to be patient a little longer. The reasonable person in our family had always been expected to surrender, so everyone else could avoid conflict. I was finished playing that role. Maribel smoothed her skirt and said she was disappointed in me. I told her I was disappointed they had asked. My father hugged me at the door, but the embrace felt stiff and uncertain. I believed the matter was over because I had answered clearly. I was wrong. 3 days later, my phone began vibrating during a design review at work and did not stop. I ignored it until lunch. When I finally checked, I had 19 missed calls and more than 40 messages, most from relatives I had not spoken to in months. The first asked how I could do that to innocent children. Another said she had never imagined I would become so cold. A cousin called me heartless, and an aunt wrote that she was praying I would find compassion. I stood in the break room reading accusation after accusation without understanding what version of the story they had heard. Then I opened social media and found Gavin's public post at the top of my feed. He never used my name, but no one in our family needed it. He wrote about being abandoned by his wife, raising 3 children alone, and fighting every day in a world that offered no support to struggling fathers. Then he described a wealthy relative with a large, mostly empty home who cared more about property than blood. He claimed his children were sleeping on an air mattress because someone pretending to love the family had slammed the door in their faces. No one had ever appeared at my door. He had never asked me directly for anything, yet hundreds of strangers were calling me selfish and spoiled, and relatives who had watched him reject me for decades were agreeing with them. The comments were especially difficult to read because Gavin had built his story from fragments of truth. His wife had left. His business had failed. His children were crowded into one room. Those facts made the lie around them feel credible. What he omitted was that he wanted me displaced, not merely asked for temporary shelter. He omitted the lack of rent, a lease, a deadline, and even a direct conversation with me. He also omitted 22 years of insisting that we were not siblings. By removing those details, he transformed my boundary into cruelty and his entitlement into desperation. I kept seeing relatives write that family should make sacrifices, yet none of them asked what sacrifice Gavin had offered to make. They did not know that I had already listened, asked practical questions, and received no practical answers. They saw children in distress and allowed that image to erase the adult who had engineered the demand. I understood the emotional reaction, but understanding it did not make the accusations hurt less. I did not respond publicly. Instead, I saved everything: the post, the comments, the messages, and the timestamps. I took screenshots and stored copies because something told me the situation was not finished. About an hour later, Gavin called. I answered against my better judgment. He skipped hello and accused me of embarrassing his mother. When I asked how I had done that, he said Maribel had cried the entire drive home because I had refused to help them. I told him she was upset because hearing the request repeated aloud had exposed how unreasonable it was. His voice turned cold. He accused me of making his children suffer over a childhood grudge. I said the issue was not childhood. It was his demand that I leave my own home so he could occupy it for free. He sighed as though explaining something to a stubborn child and told me again that I did not need all that space because I lived alone. I reminded him that my home was not his decision. He called me selfish. I said selfishness was an interesting accusation from someone who had spent 20 years denying we were family until he wanted my property. After a brief silence, he said, "Mom agrees with me." That sentence told me exactly how he expected the conflict to end. His entire life, once Maribel supported him, rules and consequences had disappeared. He still believed I was the 8-year-old girl who would eventually surrender to keep everyone calm. But Maribel's disappointment did not place her name on my mortgage. I ended the call. 2 nights later, Felix called from college. I prepared myself for another lecture, but instead, he told me he knew I had said no. He had seen Gavin's post, recognized the manipulation, and apologized for not speaking sooner. He also mentioned that the family group chat had become strangely quiet. Not angry, quiet. At the time, I did not understand the significance. People do not always become quiet because they have given up. Sometimes they become quiet because they are arranging something. The following Saturday, I was mowing my front lawn when a sport utility vehicle slowed and turned into my driveway. A second car followed, then a pickup truck pulling a small utility trailer. I recognized my aunt's vehicle first. Gavin climbed out wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap as though he had arrived for a casual weekend visit. Doors opened all along the driveway, and relatives emerged carrying cardboard boxes, plastic bins, grocery bags, and children's belongings. For a few seconds, the scene made so little sense that I wondered whether they were helping someone else nearby. Then Gavin saw me, waved, and called out, "Perfect timing." I shut off the mower and walked toward him. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Moving in," he replied, as casually as if we had made plans over coffee. Two cousins were already unloading containers from the trailer. One aunt was carrying groceries toward my porch. Then Maribel stepped out of the second car. She looked deeply uncomfortable and avoided my eyes. My father was absent, which I noticed immediately. I asked Gavin whether he had lost his mind. He rolled his eyes and said the family had discussed everything and agreed that this was best for the children. When I asked who had given the family authority over my house, he said the people who actually cared had made the decision. One cousin, visibly confused, said they had been told I had changed my mind after speaking with Maribel. I asked whether I had ever personally told him that. His expression collapsed. No one there had asked me. They had accepted Gavin's version because it allowed them to feel helpful without questioning the person who owned the property. The children had clearly been prepared for a move, which made the situation even more cruel. Their clothes, toys, and bedding were packed. They had been placed in cars and driven to my address, with adults speaking as though the decision was settled. Gavin had made them part of the pressure, without protecting them from the possibility that I would maintain the answer he already knew. I could feel several relatives watching me, waiting for the sight of the children to override everything else. For a moment, guilt rose exactly as Gavin had intended. I imagined how rejection would look from their perspective and hated that they were being made to experience it. But allowing him inside would not undo the manipulation. It would reward it and teach him that my consent could be manufactured by making refusal emotionally painful enough. I could care about the children and still refuse to let their father use them as leverage. That distinction was difficult, but it was necessary. Gavin stepped close and lowered his voice, using the tone people use with a child who is embarrassing them in public. He said everyone knew how stubborn I could be, and that once the children were physically standing there, I would stop acting this way. In that moment, I understood the plan completely. He had not come to ask again. He had decided my answer did not matter. He believed that an audience, a trailer, and 3 children on my lawn would make refusing him too humiliating. He had built the entire strategy around shame. The problem was that he had spent so many years refusing to know me that he had no idea who I had become. His youngest daughter tugged on my shirt and asked whether she could see the backyard where they were going to live. That hurt more than anything the adults had said, because none of this was the children's fault. They had been brought there believing a home was waiting for them. I knelt and told her the yard had a bird feeder and that perhaps she could visit it someday. Then I stood, walked past everyone, climbed my porch steps, unlocked the door, stepped inside, and locked it behind me. Standing behind the locked door, I could hear boxes scraping against the pavement and adults murmuring to one another. My hands were shaking, but I was not uncertain. The shaking came from the sheer violation of seeing people I knew arrive ready to occupy my home without permission. Gavin had counted on me confusing distress with doubt. I did not. I had already answered the question in the quiet of my dining room, without an audience and without anger. The presence of more people did not change the facts. It only revealed how far he was willing to go to avoid accepting them. Through the front window, I watched the relatives look at one another in confusion. About 30 seconds later, my phone rang. Gavin ordered me to open the door. I said no. He told me to stop making a scene, and I reminded him that I was standing peacefully in my own living room while he tried to move into a house he did not own. He said the children were outside in the heat. I told him he should take them somewhere they had permission to be. His voice rose as he asked whether I was really willing to do this in front of everyone. I said yes. He had chosen the audience, not me. He ended the call. 5 minutes later, someone began pounding on my door. Maribel asked through it whether we could discuss the matter calmly, like adults. I opened it only wide enough to step onto the porch, then pulled it closed behind me so no one could enter. She started to call me sweetheart. I stopped her and told her not to use affection while standing at my home with a moving crew after I had refused 3 separate times. Maribel admitted the plan had been Gavin's, but said she came because she hoped seeing the whole family together would soften my heart. I asked what she would do if I arrived at her house with a trailer after she had said no. She could not answer. Gavin answered for her, insisting that the situations were different because I did not have children. Every argument returned to the same idea. Fathering children entitled him to property earned by someone else. My 12 years of working, saving, and rebuilding that house supposedly mattered less than his decisions because I was single and childless. I moved to the edge of the porch and addressed everyone in the driveway. I asked whether anyone had discussed rent. No one had. I asked whether he had offered to pay utilities. No answer. I asked how long he planned to stay. An aunt admitted they had simply assumed it would be a few months. I looked at Gavin and asked directly. He crossed his arms and said he would stay until he was financially stable, however long that took. I asked whether that meant 6 months. He said nothing. A year, silence. 2 years, still nothing. His refusal to answer made the truth obvious to everyone. There was no deadline and no exit plan. Once he entered, removing him would become my expense, my conflict, and my reputation to defend. I turned to the cousins holding his boxes and explained that I had never consented. I had told my father and Maribel no repeatedly, both in person and in writing, and Gavin knew that when he recruited them. The cousins slowly lowered the boxes. One apologized. My aunt turned pale and asked Gavin whether it was true. He threw up his hands and accused me of twisting everything. I did not argue. I opened the text exchange with my father and handed my phone to my aunt. The messages were clear. He had asked me to reconsider. I had refused. 2 days later, he had asked again. I had refused again in complete sentences that allowed no misunderstanding. My aunt read the thread, looked at Gavin for a long time, returned my phone, picked up the grocery bags from the porch and carried them back to her car. That was when the pressure campaign collapsed. One relative after another began loading the boxes back into the vehicles. No one asked me to reconsider because they finally understood they had not been invited to help a desperate father move. They had been used as props, and Gavin had lied about my consent to get them there. As his audience dissolved, he lost control. He shouted that everyone was abandoning him and leaving his children homeless. He called my cousins cowards and accused me of arranging the humiliation. Then he turned on Maribel and screamed that she had never fought for him like a real mother. For the first time in my life, she raised her voice louder than his. Enough. The driveway went silent. Even the children froze. She faced him and said, "She told us no weeks ago. I should have respected her the first time. This is over." Gavin stared at his mother as though he could not understand the words. He asked whether she was taking my side. Maribel closed her eyes briefly, then said she was taking the side that was right. For the first time since I was 8, the person behaving reasonably was not being ordered to surrender for the sake of peace. It had taken 22 years and a driveway full of embarrassed relatives, but Maribel finally acknowledged a boundary Gavin could not erase. He looked around, waiting for someone to defend him. No one moved. My cousins continued loading the trailer. My aunt sat inside her car. Even the children stood quietly, sensing that the adults' plan had failed. Gavin doubled down. He pointed at me and shouted that I had turned everyone against him and had waited my entire life for revenge because he had never accepted me as his sister. The accusation almost made me laugh because after all his lies, he had finally admitted the central truth. "You are right about one thing," I said. "You never accepted me as your sister. And that is exactly why your demand makes no sense." He frowned, so I continued before he could interrupt. For more than 20 years, he had corrected teachers, relatives, friends, and even his own children whenever anyone connected us as siblings. When his children called me Aunt Laurel, he corrected them. He had worked for decades to ensure no one saw me as his sister. Then the moment he wanted a free house, he expected the word family to become an obligation I could not refuse. I asked him one simple question: "Am I your sister or not?" His mouth opened, but no answer came. 22 years of certainty disappeared the moment either answer carried a consequence. At that moment, my father's car pulled up along the curb. He had been grocery shopping. The instant he saw the trailer boxes and silent relatives, his face changed. He understood what had happened. He came to the porch and quietly asked whether I was all right. I said I was, but warned that nothing like this could ever happen again. He nodded. Then he turned to the family and did something I had not expected. He told the truth publicly. He said he and Maribel had asked me to reconsider several times, and that I had clearly refused each time. He confirmed that I had never suggested Gavin could move into my house. Most importantly, he admitted that allowing Gavin to believe continued pressure might change my decision had been their mistake, not mine. The last relatives who still looked uncertain finally understood. Gavin had not misunderstood my answer. He had heard it and decided to override it. My oldest cousin shook his head and told Gavin that he had claimed I had agreed. Gavin did not deny it. He began to cry, and for a brief moment I felt genuine pity. Losing a business, a marriage, a home, and your sense of control in a single year would break many people. I could recognize his pain without surrendering my property to it. Then he wiped his face, pointed at me, and screamed that everything was my fault. He said none of it would have happened if I had acted like family for once in my life. Whatever sympathy I had felt disappeared. Even after the lie was exposed, he still saw himself as the victim of my refusal, rather than the author of the disaster in my driveway. I looked past him at the adults who had come to enforce his demand and asked the question I had been waiting to ask since the first box came off the trailer. If all of you truly believe Gavin deserves a free house, why has no one offered him yours? No one answered. My aunt stared at her steering wheel. One cousin explained that his lease prohibited additional occupants. Another said he already had 4 children at home. Their reasons were valid. Every person there had a reasonable explanation for why Gavin could not move into their home. What none of them could explain was why my reasons, my ownership, and my refusal had been treated as less legitimate simply because I lived alone. Within 10 minutes, every box was back on the trailer. Doors closed, engines started, and the vehicles reversed out of my driveway, one at a time. Gavin climbed into the last car without looking at me. He had arrived with an army and left without a single person willing to carry another box for him. As the trailer disappeared around the corner, I stood on the porch of the house I had bought, repaired and protected with my own hands. I turned the key, walked back inside, and closed the door behind me. For most of my life, my family had taught me that peace required the reasonable person to give up more. That day, they finally learned that my calm did not mean consent, my independence did not make my home communal property, and the word family could not be used as a key after Gavin had spent 22 years insisting I was a stranger.